Second one is something that I've studied a lot, and the last book I wrote deals with it. I call it the great defection. This is the fact that people don't want to be in wars anymore. The prime example of this is the end of the draft. So when I was expelled from college and facing going to Vietnam, it was because we had a draft. It was because every young man signed up for it at age 18, and if you did not have a deferment, you were eligible to be drafted, and if you refused the draft, you would go to federal prison for 3 to 5 years. Okay, that was what you were dealing with. Do you know that in 1965, the draft was the most popular institution in America? More popular than the post office? The most popular institution in America in the mid-1960s was the draft. Why? Because that's what it meant to be an American, was to go serve in the military and answer your country's call. The draft was the essence of citizenship. And so the draft was, it took a big nosedive in the late 60s with the Vietnam War, but interestingly, the draft was one of the most popular institutions in America. That has changed. You could not get elected to anything if you were in favor of reviving the draft. In fact, this seems like, again, another world, a foreign country. We started to see this in the Iraq War. And this is basically something that is not well known, I think, but let me talk about that because it's now affected the kind of wars we fight. They ended the draft in 1973, and they created an all-professional army. And clearly, the move to create an all-professional army was driven largely by the dissatisfaction and resistance to the draft at the time. The all-professional army worked fine for 20 years. It actually worked fine until the United States really got into another war. There were no problems getting conscription. There was no problem getting enlistments in the all-professional army. Certainly throughout the 1980s and 1990s, there were no problems getting people to enlist. What happened was that immediately after 9/11, enlistment started to plummet. Immediately after 9/11, people stopped signing up for the military. Now, this was surprising to everybody because at the time, after 9/11, there was all this talk about, we need to, country has been attacked, we need to do things. There was the assumption that there would be a big rush of people to enlist, but that's not what happened, and it's interesting why. There was a slight increase in white enlistments. There was a dramatic decrease in enlistments of African Americans and Latinos, and African American Latinos are 45% of the military, okay? So what you saw was that even though there was a slight bump in white enlistments, so that stopped also about 6 months, there was a huge decline in the enlistments of every other demographic group. I call that the great defection. And what that means is that it is simply very, very hard to get young people to serve in the military these days. And this became a crisis in 2005. Because in 2005, what happened was that the war in Iraq was going terribly. And it was clear that absent some change, the United States needed to get more soldiers. They were just running out of soldiers. What the United States did, those of you who might have been following this, was first of all, they did away with almost all the restrictions they previously had on who could enlist. And this was a terrible problem because they started enlisting skinheads and people like this. Then they started to have morale problems in the military because the military is actually generally a pretty non-racist institution. The military is one of the better institutions, I think, on dealing with racism, and they can't have a lot of skinheads there, okay? They raised the age to enlist so that by 2006 there were over 150 grandmothers serving in Iraq. And I wrote an article about this called "We're Looking for a Few Good Grandmothers," because they were signing up anybody, okay? Now what happened as a result of that was that the military basically said, we can't fight this kind of war anymore. We can't fight a war like that because we can't get the soldiers. keep that in mind whenever someone says we need a 30-year campaign against ISIS or a 30-year campaign against that. What the military knows is that there's serious restraints on whether you can get anyone to actually fight those wars. This is not just an American phenomenon. There was a book that came out just recently called Where Have All the Soldiers Gone? From the old, you know, Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Where Have All the Soldiers Gone? And it pointed out that every rich northern country has problems now getting people to serve in the military. It's one of the reasons why the United States, you probably saw in the paper recently, they're once again reviving fast tracks to citizenship for people who will join the military. This is something they tried in 2005 and 2006. I have mixed feelings about this, by the way. I'm glad that it's harder to fight wars. There are not enough soldiers. I'm glad about that. But there was a part of the draft that I actually always liked. The part was, if there's a war going on, you should count on serving in it. And don't expect someone else to do it for you. I always thought that was a good idea. It's actually a very old idea in American political culture. So I have mixed feelings about some of this because I honestly think if people are in favor of a war, the first question they should answer is, why aren't you there? Why aren't your children there? I think that's the first question to answer there. We could talk about that too. So now we are at what I call, let me talk about the present. There is no scenario by which the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq worked out as the United States hoped. There is no scenario by which those wars worked out well. And I'll talk again in a minute, say some things about why I think this was inevitable. I don't think these wars will ever work out well, and I think that that was demonstrated in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Before I explain why, let me talk about my solution. My solution is get out of the Middle East. Now, let me give you a historical parallel to when another country did the same thing and actually turned out fine. We can talk about what the downside of that would be, but my view is that one of the things that the United States should do is simply wrap up this part of its history, okay? History's not been a good one. It's not going to be a good one if we continue, okay? But let me give you a historical parallel and then fill in a little bit about why and people's knowledge of history, this may or may not be meaningful to you, but let me suggest it and then fill it in. I think we're at what I call a Suez moment. A Suez moment. The Suez moment refers to the Suez crisis of 1956. The Suez crisis of 1956 was a defining moment in British politics. Now that I live in the UK for a good part of the year, I come to understand some of this a little bit better, and that's how I started to think about it. The Suez crisis was prompted by the ascension to power of, in Egypt, of a nationalist leader, Nasser. And what Nasser did was nationalize the Suez Canal, okay? That was what provoked the Suez crisis, the nationalization of the Suez Canal. Why was the Suez Canal important? The Suez Canal was important historically for Britain because it was access to India. And for 150 years, almost everything Great Britain did in foreign policy was dictated by its relationship to India. That's something that I don't think people study it that way, but it's amazing when you walk through British history how much of what British politics was about in foreign policy was maintaining their connection to India. Why? Because India was considered to be economically essential to Britain. Without India, Britain would have been a third-rate power. Without India, Britain would have not been an economic power. India was the key to the economic and therefore military success of Great Britain. Why do you have to have the Suez Canal? Because you have to have that access to India. But the interesting thing was that the Suez Canal was such a the Suez crisis was such a debacle. It was a story of incompetence that is only rivaled by the first months of the occupation of Iraq. I mean, the first months of the occupation of Iraq will be forever, I think, unrivaled, an example of complete incompetence. But the Suez crisis rivaled it, okay? And the interesting thing was that the British people, they decided a number of things. They decided, first of all, whatever economic essential role India had in the past, it wasn't going to play that role anymore. First of all, India didn't want to play that role anymore. And second of all, the UK didn't need India in the way it did. Let me suggest an analogy between Britain and India and the United States in the Middle East. Whatever role the United States has played, whatever role the Middle East has played for the United States in the past, I don't think it needs to play that role anymore. First of all, I don't think we should be reliant on oil. Second of all, to the extent to which we need oil, I don't think we need the Middle East to get it. I actually think it has become a part of the world which is not connected to the country the way it once was. But more than that, what the British realized was this imperialism thing is just not working out anymore. The Indians don't want it. The Egyptians don't want it. You can fight a little skirmish, you know, and sing Rule Britannia, and guess what? Things will be more messed up when you're done, okay? I think that's where we are in the United States. I think that's where we are in the United States. I think what we need to realize is, first of all, these parts of the world should be left to solve their own problems, and second of all, in reality, it's not that important, okay? Now, nothing was more important than India to Britain. And their whole culture was based around. The whole culture was based around the dominance of India, okay? But guess what? Largely they had no choice. They changed by that, and you know what? The UK is doing fine. It's really doing fine when it decided that imperial project was over. I think we should stand at that same moment today, a Suez moment. We need to get it over with, okay? To understand what it means to get over with it, and I'll start to wrap it up here, I've written a distinction of two types of conflicts. This is a distinction we find. I was initially in a program called The Changing Character of War, and this is a distinction we worked with a lot. It's a distinction between wars and hostilities. Now, when we talk about wars, we talk about it as if they're all one thing. And much of the rhetoric around war is, well, this is just like, you know, World War II. This is just World War II all over again. But actually, historically, and really since about the 17th century, countries like the United States and the rich and developed countries have really fought two very different types of conflicts. Two quite different types of conflicts. Here's how I distinguish them. A war is like a conflict between France and Germany. Paradigm conflict, okay? These conflicts went on for a long time. A war is between two established states. Usually one invades the other, and usually the goal of the one that's been invaded is to push the other one back to its borders. Interestingly, state-state wars like that have for a long time obeyed certain rules of war. There's a certain kind of protocol about them. There's a whole notion of what's a just war or not. And notice the other side, though it's the enemy, is still considered rational. It's still considered to be kind of like us, okay? And even, by the way, during the Cold War, when they were facing nuclear war, there was still the assumption, you know, that the Russian leaders were rational people. The policy was based on the notion that they weren't going to start a war without, you know, without some kind of very extraordinary reason. If you read about the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was assumption that we're dealing with people like us, okay, who've been put in this dilemma. That's what a war is. It's a fairly kind of defined thing between people who think of themselves as part of the same community, and usually has actually fairly limited goals. Such was the war between the United States and Great Britain in the American Revolution. That was a classic war. United States versus Great Britain in the American Revolution. Goal, push the British out, okay? Hostilities are a quite different type of conflict. Hostilities are a conflict which almost always have a racist dimension to them. And that's why the term hostility originated in the United States to describe the relationship between Euro-Americans and Native peoples. Those were hostilities. And it's interesting when you read the story of the conflicts with Native peoples, even though they sometimes divide it up into discrete wars, more what you're reading about is an ongoing condition of hostilities, a permanent condition of hostilities. What characterizes a hostility? First of all, the enemy is not rational. The enemy is either primitive, illogical, or a fanatic. So what characterizes a hostility is that you cannot negotiate with the enemy. In the end, you have to just kill them. That's what characterizes a hostility, and that's why hostilities are so terrible, is because they have always this kind of genocidal impact, okay? A war seeks victory, a hostility seeks pacification. Another way to think about it. The goal is to pacify the other people, where pacifies means sort of put them in permanent subservience, okay? Now, generally what you see in modern times is you see wars between European powers, and you see hostilities between European powers and the non-European world. And these are really two quite different types of wars. They abide by different ethical principles. The second really doesn't abide by any ethical principles at all, quite frankly. The laws of war are usually thrown out in hostilities, okay? Now, what the United States is facing today in its dealings with ISIS and whatever is hostilities. And notice the rhetoric that surrounds it. The enemy is completely irrational. They can't be bargained with. They can't be negotiated with. And interestingly, because of that, no one can even say what victory looks like. It's interesting. With most wars between European countries, it was pretty clear what victory would look like. When you enter into hostilities, you enter into a war where no one can even say at the beginning what would victory look like. And that was, by the way, my worry about the Afghanistan war when we entered into it is I didn't know what victory looked like there. It seemed as if victory in the Iraq war was going to be the deposing of Saddam Hussein, but we found out very, very quickly actually that wasn't victory. Victory was something that had to do with restoring democracy in Iraq or something like that. It's interesting that there's no clear goal, which is why we would need to worry about those wars so much. If you don't know what you're trying to achieve, it's a license to go on forever. Now, finally, let me say some words in conclusion about why I think we're at a Suez moment to get out, and in this case, and then we can talk about some of the other things I've raised. You can't win hostilities anymore if you're a developed country. You can't win it. So setting aside all the ethically horrible and dubious things about it, you can't win a war like this. You simply cannot win it. The reason why is because of the development of guerrilla tactics, which has been going on basically since the Napoleonic Wars. And this is the thesis of, there's a wonderful book by Jonathan Schell called Unconquerable World. It's really a very, very good book. But one of the things he says is, and he actually agrees with people who study war, is that war has become completely useless. The whole point of war is to win, and we've now gotten ourselves into wars where, first of all, we don't even know what winning looks like, and second of all, whatever it looks like, we can't get it, okay? How could we get it? How could we win a hostility like what's going on in the Middle East? I suppose if we sent in 3 or 4 million troops, we could do it. That's not going to happen. And everything we've learned from Afghanistan and Iraq is that the American military is simply no longer capable of influencing things that much anymore. In the way that I think the British realized whatever value they might have had in the rest of the world, they're simply not capable of projecting that kind of impact on the world. So in conclusion, I continue to agree with Martin Luther King. America should not be the policeman of the world. He asked, the first question he asked is, who appointed us the policeman of the world? America should look at the problems closer to home. If we're talking about wars, we have plenty to deal with at home. I don't know if you know that the deadliest war in the Western Hemisphere of the last 100 years is going on at this very moment, which is the Mexican drug war. Mexican drug war is the deadliest war in the Western Hemisphere of the 20th century, okay? We would have plenty to do if we were worried about things of helping out deal with that situation. So we return to home, we deal with our problems here, and we be a little bit more humble. Do you realize how weird this country is? Do you know that you can't run for office in this country without saying we're the greatest country ever in the world? You know how that, yeah, you have to say that. We're the greatest country ever. You realize how infantile that is? Suppose your roommate invited you over for dinner. Suppose your roommate invited you over to dinner. I want you to meet my parents. Let's come over for dinner. We're just starting here at Cal State Fresno. Come over for dinner. I want you to meet my parents. You sat down to dinner with your roommate's parents, and the father says, you know, we're the greatest family in Fresno. And the mother said, in fact, we're the greatest family that's ever been. You wouldn't sit there and have a philosophical discussion about what great meant. You would think there's something seriously wrong with these people, that they think about the world in that way. And I think that is, in some sense, to me, part of the lesson of humility that, as I said, my heroes like Martin Luther King bring us. You know, return home, deal with our problems, and recognize that we're no different than anyone else. Thanks very much.